I remember the way she looked at me that morning, the mix of disbelief and silent judgment in her eyes. Our son had just stumbled through another humiliating encounter at school, and I had finally, for the first time, raised my voice in his defense. I told her he wasn't weak, he wasn't a failure, and he didn't deserve to be mocked by people who were supposed to be peers, or by anyone. I thought she would understand, that she would see the truth I had been carrying silently for years. But instead, I saw something shift. She turned away slowly, her shoulders stiff, her face unreadable, and then she left. Just like that, the apartment felt colder, emptier, as if the air itself had abandoned me. I called her name, but there was only the echo of my own desperation. I was left with our son staring at me, eyes wide and confused, seeking reassurance I barely had for myself. The betrayal didn't feel immediate. It crept in quietly, like a shadow sliding across the floor. I had expected arguments, tears, maybe even anger, but not this silent exodus. And as I sat there, my chest tightening, the weight of isolation settled in. I realized in that moment that defending my son had cost me more than I imagined. Not just the fragile balance of our family, but the partner I thought I could trust. Everything familiar suddenly felt fragile, and I knew that nothing would ever feel the same again. The apartment felt impossibly quiet after she left, every corner echoing with the absence of her presence. I sat on the couch, staring at the empty doorway, trying to make sense of what had just happened, my heart still hammering from the confrontation. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, the way I had defended our son, the way she had looked at me as if I were the one who had caused the problem. Loneliness settled over me like a heavy blanket, thick and suffocating. In that silence, memories began to surface, the subtle moments that, at the time, I had brushed aside. How she would always favor our son in minor ways, praising him excessively while quietly criticizing me for protecting him, as if standing up for him was somehow a betrayal. I remembered holidays where she subtly excluded me from decisions, leaving me feeling like an outsider in my own home, little betrayals that now looked like pieces of a puzzle I had refused to assemble. I thought about the small competitions she orchestrated, the comparisons that never seemed fair, and the quiet resentment she let linger like smoke in the air. It all came flooding back, the whispered comments, the smirks, the way she always seemed to side with convenience over loyalty. I felt exposed, suddenly aware of all the times I had swallowed my pride, kept silent, and ignored the signs that our family dynamic was not what I had believed. Shock and sorrow collided inside me, leaving me both numb and painfully aware. Every memory stung, each one a reminder that this moment, her walking away after I defended our son, was not an isolated incident, but the inevitable culmination of years of subtle favoritism, unspoken judgments, and quiet betrayals that had quietly built walls between us. I looked over at my son, sitting silently on the edge of his bed, his small shoulders hunched and eyes wide with confusion. He didn't understand why Mom had left, why the person who was supposed to shield him from the world had suddenly vanished. The humiliation from earlier that day still lingered on his face, the sting of cruel words from classmates, the teasing he couldn't shake. My heart ached watching him struggle to make sense of it all, and I felt a mix of anger, fear, and helplessness surge through me. I wanted to protect him, to erase the sting of those words and the sharp betrayal of his mother. But I was also grappling with the fact that our family, as he knew it, was crumbling around us. I pulled him close, holding him in a way that spoke, more than words ever could, whispering assurances I barely believed myself. I promised him that we would get through this, that he wasn't alone, that I would always stand by him. Yet even as I said those words, I felt the weight of reality pressing in. Defending him had shifted everything, shattered the fragile sense of security our family had maintained, and exposed the cracks I had long tried to ignore. I replayed the day in my mind, the school incident, my words to her, the look she gave me before leaving, and realized that every choice I had made to protect my son now carried consequences far beyond the classroom. My resolve hardened, but it was tempered with fear. Fear of what this would do to him, fear of the tension growing between us, and fear of navigating a world where the person I trusted most had turned away. And yet, beneath the anxiety and pain, there was a flicker of determination. I would defend him, come what may, and I would find a way to rebuild what had been broken, no matter how high the walls now seemed. By the next morning, the silence of our apartment was replaced by a storm I hadn't anticipated. Word of what had happened spread faster than I could process. Family, neighbors, even distant acquaintances seemed to know before I did. My phone buzzed incessantly, messages dripping with judgment, sympathy, and sometimes cruel amusement. Cousins I barely spoke to sent cryptic texts. Friends of my wife made pointed remarks at gatherings I wasn't even invited to, and whispers followed me wherever I went. It felt like the world had divided itself, and I was standing alone in the middle, caught in a maelstrom of opinions and assumptions. Every glance from relatives carried unspoken questions. Did he do something wrong? Did he fail as a husband? I felt exposed, the tiny cracks in my family life amplified into a spectacle of social humiliation. I noticed how some aunts subtly sided with my wife, nodding at her supposed perspective as if my son and I were the outsiders. Every word, every gesture, seemed calculated to remind me of my isolation, to deepen the sting of their judgment. FOMO gnawed at me, not the fear of missing out on parties or privileges, but the fear of being sidelined in my own life, dismissed and disbelieved while the narrative spun without me. And yet, amidst the chaos, I felt a quiet resolve solidifying inside me. I couldn't control their whispers or opinions, but I could control my response, my actions, and most importantly, my son's safety and dignity. This realization was both terrifying and empowering, setting the stage for the difficult choices that lay ahead. A week later, the monotony of our quiet apartment was interrupted by an unexpected delivery. A small folded napkin tucked inside a plain envelope, postmarked from the state prison. I stared at it for a long moment, unsure whether to open it or simply set it aside. My son's eyes were wide with curiosity, sensing the shift in my attention, and I felt a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. When I finally unfolded the napkin, my hands trembling slightly, I found a few cryptic lines scrawled in hurried handwriting. Words that seemed ordinary at first glance but carried weight I couldn't immediately decipher. It spoke of truths hidden, mistakes acknowledged, and a reckoning that was coming, though it offered no clarity on the how or when. The message was unsettling, a whisper from someone trapped and powerless, yet it ignited a spark of possibility in me. For the first time in days, I felt the tension shift, like the air itself had changed its current. What had started as a simple act of betrayal now hinted at opportunity, a chance for reversal that I hadn't imagined. Questions flooded my mind. Who had sent it? What exactly did it mean? And how could it reshape the fractured dynamics of our family? I folded the napkin carefully and tucked it into my pocket, a talisman of both mystery and potential, knowing instinctively that this small piece of paper could alter everything we thought we knew about loyalty, justice, and the balance of power in our home. From that moment, the sense of helplessness that had weighed on me began to waver, replaced by the electric tension of anticipation, the kind that comes before a storm breaks. In the days that followed, I found myself poring over every memory, every conversation, and every small clue I had ignored before. The napkin had stirred something in me, a need to understand not just what had happened, but why. I began retracing moments with my wife, revisiting our arguments, her subtle remarks, the way she had always seemed to measure me against some invisible standard. Slowly, patterns emerged. I remembered the whispers she would share with friends, the small exaggerations of my failures, the way she seemed to court favor with people who could elevate her status while diminishing mine. Beyond her, I started noticing external forces. Relatives who had quietly undermined me, neighbors who had exaggerated our conflicts, and friends who had sided with her without ever knowing the full story. Each revelation stung, but it also clarified the landscape of deception surrounding us. My empathy for my son deepened as I realized he had been navigating this web of manipulation from the start, caught in the crossfire of ambition and control. My anger simmered, but alongside it, a calculated clarity emerged. I understood that the betrayal wasn't random or impulsive. It was deliberate, layered, and reinforced by a network of people invested in the outcome. And yet beneath the hurt and the growing fury, there was a sliver of hope. Knowledge is power, and now that I saw the truth, I had the chance to reclaim control, to protect my son, and to expose the forces that had sought to undermine us both. Each piece of the puzzle I uncovered brought the tension higher, drawing me closer to the moment when the hidden injustices could no longer remain unchallenged. I realized that anger alone would get me nowhere. If I wanted to protect my son and reclaim some control over our fractured lives, I needed strategy. I started quietly, methodically, taking steps that no one would notice until the results were undeniable. I reviewed our finances, uncovering discrepancies and subtle mismanagement that had gone unnoticed for years. I contacted lawyers discreetly, not to confront her immediately, but to understand my options, my leverage. Even small victories, a corrected account, a timely intervention on a legal matter, a phone call that shifted a minor custody detail in our favor, felt monumental. Each success was a whisper of power, a subtle shift in the balance that had always favored her. I noticed how these moves, though invisible to most, began to change the way people interacted with me. Relatives who had dismissed me now approached with cautious respect. Friends who had taken sides paused in their judgments. For the first time since she had left, I felt the scales tilting. It wasn't dramatic, not yet, but it was undeniable. I was no longer merely reacting. I was shaping the narrative, quietly asserting authority, and laying the groundwork for a reversal that would come when the time was right. The realization filled me with a mix of relief and exhilaration. The first true taste of control in weeks, and a reminder that even the smallest, calculated moves could ripple outward into consequences no one could ignore. The subtle victories I had begun to accumulate did not go unnoticed, and I quickly realized that perception had power almost equal to action. Where once I had been dismissed, whispered about, or quietly mocked, people now approached me with cautious curiosity. I could feel the shift in their tone, the way their smiles carried a hint of calculation, as if trying to determine whether I had regained footing or was still stumbling. I watched how some relatives, once confident in their moral high ground, now hesitated to judge openly, while neighbors who had assumed I was powerless began treating me differently, offering cautious respect. The contrast was stark and almost surreal. Those who had been admired for wealth, charm, or influence now seemed vulnerable, while I, long underestimated, stood taller, quietly claiming a new space in the social landscape. My son noticed it too, his eyes lighting up when people treated us with a newfound regard, and it gave him a subtle sense of pride that warmed my heart. Yet I knew better than to let these small shifts make me complacent. The landscape was delicate, filled with envy, resentment, and unspoken alliances. Every glance, every offhand comment could conceal a hidden motive, every smile a mask. Still, within that tense social web, I felt a growing thrill, the realization that perception could be as powerful as action, that the people who had once dismissed us were now beginning to see that I was no longer the man they had assumed, and that in this quiet recalibration, the first seeds of justice were taking root. I started noticing small changes in my son, subtle shifts that spoke louder than words. Where he had once hesitated, shrinking in the shadow of criticism or judgment, he now carried himself with a quiet confidence, a resilience I hadn't seen before. At dinner one evening, he looked at me and said, "Dad, I think we can handle this together." And something in my chest clenched with both pride and relief. It was a simple statement, yet it carried the weight of an unspoken pact, a shared understanding that we were no longer alone in facing the chaos surrounding us. We spent hours talking, dissecting the injustices we had endured, and planning small steps toward regaining control, not with vengeance for its own sake, but with careful, deliberate strategy. Each conversation deepened our bond, reinforced our trust, and made the stakes feel intensely personal. I could see the pride in his eyes, the way he stood a little taller, spoke a little firmer, and carried himself with a sense of purpose. The helplessness that had haunted him, and by extension me, began to recede, replaced by a determination that was as infectious as it was inspiring. In those moments, I realized that defending him had not only preserved his dignity, it had sparked a transformation in both of us. We were no longer simply reacting to the world. We were preparing to confront it, together, as a team. And as I watched him laugh over something small and absurd, I understood that our bond had become our strength, a shield against the betrayal, the judgment, and the uncertainties that still awaited us. The day finally came when I could no longer let the tension simmer quietly. I arranged a meeting under the guise of civility, knowing that beneath polite words and measured smiles, the real stakes would emerge. My wife arrived first, her posture defensive, eyes wary, scanning the room as if expecting an ambush. Behind her, subtle glances from relatives and acquaintances spoke volumes. They had assumed control, judged my motives, and whispered their predictions. I sat across from her, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable, before I carefully unfolded the napkin. The handwriting was unmistakable, and as I read its cryptic message aloud, the room seemed to still. Every word revealed hidden truths, exposing her motives and the intricate web of manipulation that had been orchestrated by those around her. Her face changed subtly at first, a flicker of doubt, then shock, as she realized that what had seemed insignificant now held undeniable weight. The people who had whispered judgments and offered opinions now shifted uncomfortably, their confidence shaken. I watched as the cleverness of the message, the timing of its revelation, and the precision of my approach flipped the power dynamic entirely. The room that had once been stacked against me now held my control, and I felt a rush of vindication tempered by restraint. Every revelation landed with impact. The alliances that had once seemed unassailable began to crumble, leaving her and the external antagonist vulnerable, exposed, and suddenly aware that the rules had changed. It was a twist none of them had anticipated, delivered quietly but irrevocably, and in that moment, the balance of power had shifted in ways that could not be undone. The aftermath of the confrontation was immediate and undeniable. Once the napkin's message had been revealed, the air shifted, heavy with astonishment and the subtle sting of humiliation. My wife's carefully cultivated composure faltered, her confident facade cracking as whispers spread through the room like wildfire. Relatives who had positioned themselves as arbiters of morality now struggled to reconcile their assumptions with the undeniable truths laid bare before them. Invitations were rescinded, subtle slights turned into awkward stares, and the social fabric they had relied on to assert dominance began to unravel. Even acquaintances who had once quietly mocked me now approached cautiously, some with admiration, others with guilt, all of them acknowledging, without words, that the balance had changed. I watched as the weight of their miscalculations, manipulations, and hidden agendas landed squarely on them. It wasn't violent or vengeful. It was justice served quietly but decisively, a moral reckoning that left them exposed in ways that words could scarcely capture. My son observed everything, eyes wide but gleaming with pride, and I could see the lesson sinking in. Standing up, being smart, and biding your time could turn the tide against even the most entrenched adversaries. The tension that had been building for weeks, months, even years, finally released in waves of stunned silence, incredulous murmurs, and the occasional awkward apology. And in that moment I felt a deep, grounding satisfaction, not from cruelty, but from the recognition that truth, patience, and strategy could restore dignity and right the scales that had once been tipped unfairly. Every sneer, every smug comment, every whispered judgment now ricocheted back to its source, and the quiet thrill of karmic justice settled over me like a shield. The room, once dominated by fear and manipulation, now acknowledged a new reality. The underestimated man, the protective father, and the quietly patient observer had orchestrated a reversal that left everyone who had doubted us humbled, exposed, and forever changed. That evening, after the storm had passed and the echoes of whispers faded, my son and I sat together in the quiet of our living room. The weight of everything that had happened pressed on us, but there was also a strange, grounding sense of relief. We talked about the betrayals, the manipulations, and the small victories that had led us here, sharing memories that were painful, yet illuminating. I saw in him a newfound confidence, a spark that had been dulled by fear and humiliation now shining bright. I reflected on my own journey, the mistakes I had made, the patience I had cultivated, and the courage it had taken to act when the stakes were highest. Justice had been delivered, not through loud confrontation or reckless revenge, but through strategy, resilience, and careful timing. Our dignity remained intact, and in that preservation there was profound satisfaction. My son leaned against me, and for the first time in weeks, we laughed softly, acknowledging the absurdity and intensity of our ordeal. In that quiet, bittersweet moment, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't in humiliating others, but in protecting what mattered most, reclaiming our sense of self and emerging stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever before. Over the following weeks, life settled into a new rhythm, one shaped by lessons learned and boundaries firmly established. My son and I found comfort in our strengthened bond, navigating each day with a quiet confidence that had been absent before. Relationships with extended family remained cautious, some offering tentative reconciliation while others retreated, their pride intact but humbled. I reflected on my own growth, how defending my son had tested every ounce of patience and strategy I possessed, and how the challenges had forged a clearer sense of purpose and resilience. The chaos and betrayal had not broken us. Instead, they revealed our capacity to endure, to act with integrity, and to rise above manipulation. There was satisfaction in knowing justice had been served without sacrificing morality, in seeing those who underestimated us recognize our strength, and in witnessing my son's pride in our journey. It was a quiet, enduring victory, one that left both of us whole, wiser, and prepared for whatever challenges might come next. Sitting with my son that evening, I realized the truth we had uncovered went beyond betrayal. It was a lesson in patience, discernment, and quiet strength. Life had tested us, but by choosing strategy over anger, integrity over impulsiveness, we had reclaimed our power without compromising who we were. The napkin, the whispers, the judgments, all had served to reveal character, and justice had quietly unfolded as it always does when preparation meets opportunity. I wanted my son to remember that courage isn't always loud, and triumph isn't always public. Sometimes it's in the steady reclaiming of dignity and the careful unraveling of deception. As we looked forward, I knew challenges would come again. But for now, we had proven that standing firm, protecting what matters, and acting with intelligence and heart could turn even betrayal into a lesson in empowerment. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder what the next twist of fate might bring. Another story, waiting to test our resolve.